Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us on Business Incorporated. I'm Chimezie Obi Iwawu. On the show today, Nigeria's Purchasing Managers Index for November tops 57.9 reading. South Africa's APSA PMI rises for the first time in 3 months. Plus, Qatar plans to withdraw from OPEC to focus on gas output. We'll begin the show with Nigeria as the Purchasing Managers Index for November tops 57.9 reading, representing an expansion in the manufacturing sector for the 20th month. The monthly report from the central bank shows that the index grew at a faster rate when compared to the index in the previous month, with increase in all the 14 subsectors. The composite PMI for the non-manufacturing sector stood at 58.4 points in the same period, indicated improvements in the non-manufacturing PMI for the 19th consecutive month. At 59.9 points, the production level index for the manufacturing sector also rose for the 21st consecutive month in November 2018. The report shows that the employment level index in the same period stood at 55.4 points, indicating growth in employment level for the 19th month in a row. Meanwhile, South Africa's seasonally adjusted APSA Purchasing Managers Index rose in November, supported by an uptick in new orders and business activity. The index, which is compiled by the Bureau for Economic Research and gauges manufacturing activity in Africa's most industrialized economy, rose to 49.5 in November from 42.4 in October, just missing the 50 mark, separating contraction from expansion. The index stood at a revised 44.5 in September and 43.4 in August. It stood at 51.5 in July. South Africa's Energy Department says over the weekend that the petrol price will decrease by 184 cents a litre, while wholesale diesel price to decrease by 147.4 cents a litre from December 5. And to the markets now, the Johannesburg Stock Index outperformed at Intra-Day, leading the gains by 3.21%. South Africa's focused investors are waiting for the release of third quarter GDP numbers on Tuesday and current account figures for the 3 months to September on Thursday. Meanwhile, Nigerian Index and the EGX 30 in Egypt were down 0.15% and 0.87% each. Kenya closed in the positive on Friday. In the Middle East, mixed sentiment was seen across the markets, with the markets in the UAE falling into the red at intraday. Qatar led gains by 1.30%, and Saudi was up 0.87%. In Europe, stocks rallied in early trade after President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping negotiated a temporary truce to their trade conflict over the weekend. For more, let's bring in Paul Christian Breeze to tell us more. Hello, Paul. Good afternoon. A beautiful week to you. Good to have you on the show again.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Our U.S. and China have agreed to a 90-day truce in their trade war battle. What's the deal about, and is everyone caught off guard by this short ceasefire?
Not a lot of people were expecting a year-end rally anymore, because months and months of negotiations in this conflict between the U.S. and China didn't give a lot of hope for optimism. Now that optimism is back on the table, you can see behind me here in Frankfurt, the German blue chip DAX has been flying high all morning, and this kind of optimism is spread across Europe and also across markets in Asia. Really, nobody was really expecting this anymore, and that's even though there isn't much advance. It's just that we're not going to see much more escalation, because the 90-day truce just means that the U.S. is not going to raise its import tariffs on China from the current 10 to 25% in January. Instead, there's a 90 days negotiating period, after which these tariffs will come if there isn't a solution. In 90 days is a pretty short timeline considering how long negotiations have been going on. One particular piece of information that wasn't part of the official communication, but that did trigger a lot of response, was a tweet by Donald Trump, who said that China had agreed to drop its car tariffs and that's 40% of tariffs on U.S.-made cars. So that it's quite a significant amount here, and accordingly, car makers' shares were rising today. Here in Germany, we have a BMW at the forefront, also Daimler and Volkswagen, because of course they produce in the U.S. BMW, for example, produces luxury cars in the U.S. and then ships them over to China. So that's a big benefit for these companies.
All right, let's look at the latest in the global oil market. Qatar's junior oil minister says his country plans exit from OPEC next January is rather strategic rather than political. Is that what the analyst community and markets believe?
Well, there's the official reason, and then there's the unofficial reason, and of course, the unofficial reason does play some role here. Yes, Qatar does want to focus more on natural gas. After all, the country sits on the largest natural gas resource, the largest field in the world, and it wants to benefit from that. But the move is also seen as a sort of stab to Saudi Arabia, who's the de facto leader of the OPEC cartel, and who's been trying to pressure Qatar into rolling over, especially on its Iran policies. That big natural gas field that I mentioned, Qatar shares with Iran, and so the two neighbors are well, naturally bound together. But Iran is the arch enemy of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia was hoping to get Qatar to sort of get out of these ties with Iran, putting a blockade on the country, not just Saudi Arabia, but also neighboring countries. Meanwhile, Qatar has been trying to create it or make its economy more independent from this, more independent from oil. Now it's made this move to become more independent in oil production, even though it only holds 2% of the world's oil resources. So that's not going to make a big dent on OPEC. The price of oil has risen today around 5%. However, not due to the Qatar exit, rather than to the decision, a preliminary agreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia to cut output ahead of the Thursday meeting in Vienna.
All right, let's look at what's happening in France. Paris is reeling in extensive riots described as one of the worst in several years, pushing President Emmanuel Macron to weigh a declaration of a state of emergency. Now, what is the reaction across Europe on this?
Well, first of all, in a generally buoyant European market, French shares, especially of shares that are sensitive to the economy and to tourism, they took a hit. The supermarket chain Carrefour, highway operator Vinci, also Air France, and French hotels, because people are worried that maybe tourism will take a hit from this after Emmanuel Macron has failed to contain these riots and the anger among the people. And that's also the reaction that we get in the international media here in Europe, and pointing to Macron, because this movement, these riots that we've seen, they started out as protests against a rise in fuel tax that would hurt some more than others. Specifically, it would have more of an impact in rural areas, but it's now grown into a much larger movement that is dissatisfied with the way the economy works out in general. It is generally doing very well, the French economy. However, it doesn't trickle down to everyone. There's a larger gap between the rich and the poor. There's a larger division between city folks and those in the periphery. And Emmanuel Macron has been showing a very steady policy. He's not budged on any of this, but that may come back to haunt him, because while in the earlier times he might have been able to get rid of this problem, it is now growing bigger and bigger, and only now is he starting to open up to talk to these protesters, to hear their needs.
All right, thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of the day, and